Hello everyone, it's rum time. This was a video I was doing and I didn't have time to finish. So I'm going to finish it now. And we're all going to be happy and we're going to do it because rum said so. Video.
Be at all surprised that former camp slaves were welcomed and honored at Confederate veterans events, especially from the 1920s on. It was the height of Jim Crow, and an important justification for segregation was that black people were being oppressed for their own good. Unlike the lost...
By the way, this is part 2 of Were There Really Black Confederates? I have already done part 1. I'm pretty sure if you're watching this, then part 1's already up. Go find it.
Cause myth of today, which tries to paint the Confederacy as some sort of egalitarian paradise, the lost cause myth of the early 20th century maintained that blacks had been better off as slaves, and that the best hope for black Americans going forward was for them to defer to white authority. But during World War I, black Southern soldiers had been treated more or less as equals in Europe, and saw firsthand that a desegregated society was possible. Consequently, upon returning home, they aggressively fought for their rights. Many white Southerners fought back, both with violence and propaganda. Not every black Southerner was quite so radical. In fact, their politics were pretty neatly divided along generational lines. Younger black people were avowed agitators. Older black people, including many former slaves, were content not to rock the boat. Their deference gave the white elite the exact ammunition they needed to counter the activist narrative. So when former camp slaves appeared at Confederate veterans events, they were placed front and center as ideal examples of well-behaved blacks. Speaking of pensions, a 1921 article in the Confederate Veteran magazine noted that
a new feature in the pension appropriation of Tennessee makes an allowance for pensions to the faithful Negroes who were in the war with their masters and served them to the end. Doubtless other states of the South will make similar provision for their old Negroes, whose loyalty under the circumstances showed a fine sense of honor not apparent in later generations of the race.
Many of these black men also wanted to lay claim to the sense of martial masculinity that the white people of their generation enjoyed. And we can kind of see why that makes sense. We just put ourselves in their shoes for a second. We can really understand that the... Lord, give me the strength to resist the Yankee invader, the violator of our homes and firesides. Let me destroy him with facts and logic, Lord. I am your humble servant.
Hello there.
Lord, is that really you? It's a Christmas miracle.
Yes, it's me. But I wasn't really born on Christmas. It's a vile pagan carnival, and everyone who celebrates it is going to hell.
It's my day to be with you, Lord. If so, I come to you with all the joy in my heart.
No, Johnny. I have come to answer your prayers. Take this. It is a book
Is that Ewan McGregor?
of primary sources to counter Billy's arguments.
So says.
Yes. Now go, my son. Go boldly into the combat. And remember, Catholics and Quakers worship the devil and should be killed.
I'll remember, Lord.
You are wise and strong, and I am very proud of you. Goodbye.
The happy, faithful slave fit in neatly with the early 20th century's popular image of the Confederacy. This guy has no idea what he is talking about. There were black Confederates, and no, they weren't just cooks or camp hands. From most accounts I've read, they were riflemen. Sources. First, on account by Dr. Lewis Steiner, the inspector of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. In his diary, he described observing our brave boys entering Frederick, Maryland in the invasion of 1862.
This morning, the rebel army began to move from our town. The most liberal calculations could not give them more than 64,000 men, Over 3,000 Negroes must be included in this number. These were clad in all kinds of uniforms. Most of the Negroes had arms, rifles, muskets, sabers, bowie knives, dirks, etc. They were supplied, in many instances, with knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, etc., and were manifestly an integral portion of the Southern Confederacy Army.
Steiner was right. Slaves were an integral portion of the Confederate Army. What he's observing here are camp slaves performing one of their many functions, carrying their master's weapons and equipment on a long march.
Next, an account from one of Badan's sharpshooters who saw a black Confederate at the siege of Yorktown, Virginia.
For a considerable time during the siege, the enemy had a Negro rifle shooter in their front who kept up a close fire on our men, and although the distance was great, yet he caused more or less annoyance by his persistent shooting. At one occasion, while at the advanced posts with the detail, the rider with his squad had an opportunity to note the skill of this determined darky with his well-aimed rifle.
Yeah, there are a few accounts by some United States soldiers that claim the exact same thing. Even if they correctly identified these soldiers as black, which at the distances we're talking about is a big if, it still wouldn't prove the existence of black Confederate soldiers. All it would demonstrate is that some camp slaves picked up their rifles and shot at Yankees, which is entirely believable because some slaves were genuinely loyal, and in the heat of battle, who knows what could happen.
And finally, in September of 1861, Frederick Douglass, of all people, wrote in his own newspaper that
It is now pretty well established that there are at the present moment many colored men in the Confederate Army doing duty as real soldiers. There were such soldiers at Manassas, and they're probably still there.
How would Douglas know? Was he at Manassas? And you're ignoring the context here. Douglas was using these rumors of armed camp slaves to try to drum up support in the North for arming black regiments. As he goes on to say in that same article,
Rising above vulgar prejudice, the slaveholding rebel accepts the aid of the black man as readily as that of any other. If a bad cause can do this, why should a good cause be less wisely conducted? We insist upon it that one black regiment in such a war as this is, without being any more brave and orderly, would be worth to the government more than two of any other, and that while the government continues to refuse the aid of colored men, thus alienating them from the national cause and giving the rebels the advantage of them, it will not deserve better fortunes than it has thus far experienced.
he was less concerned about the veracity of those reports as he was about their political usefulness. And in any event, the idea that hearsay from Union soldiers are reliable sources is absurd, and you wouldn't even be bringing that up if there was a single piece of Confederate documentation to substantiate your claims. You know, there actually were black Confederate soldiers.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. He admitted it. I think we're done here.
But only after the Confederate Congress had allowed the military to enlist black soldiers in March of 1865, just 3 weeks before the surrender at Appomattox. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to avoid defeat, but it didn't work. The Confederacy was doomed, in part due to the 200,000 black men who were already serving in the Union Army. By the end of the war, black soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army's manpower and had suffered more than 10,000 combat casualties. There were only ever a few hundred black Confederate soldiers in the spring of 1865, and they barely saw any action. And despite the public endorsement of Robert E. Lee, the idea to arm black men had been extremely controversial in the Confederacy for the better part of a year. The idea was first proposed by General Patrick Cleburne, who wrote in 1863 that
The measure will at one blow strip the enemy of foreign sympathy and assistance and transfer him to the south. It'll dry up two of his three sources of recruiting. It'll take from his Negro army the only motive it could have to fight against the south, and it will probably cause much of it to desert over to us. The immediate effect of the emancipation and enrollment of Negroes in the military strength of the south would be to enable us to have armies numerically superior to those of the north, and a reserve of any size we might think necessary. It would instantly remove all the vulnerability, embarrassment, and inherent weakness which result from slavery.
Aha! A woke Confederate general. You seriously expect me to believe that the man who wrote that fought for slavery?
he was one of the better ones for sure, but Cleburne by no means spoke for the Confederate leadership.
Yeah.
In the first days of 1864, he shared his proposal with his commanding officer, Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston dismissed it out of hand and actually ordered Cleburne to stop spreading those dangerous notions. Nevertheless, a copy of the proposal ended up on the desk of Jefferson Davis. He actually also ordered it suppressed. But as the tide of war began turning against the South, Davis warmed to the idea and in November of 1864 presented a watered-down version of it to Congress. Congress was furious. They rejected it. But the whole thing sparked off this huge and incredibly divisive public debate. For many Confederates, arming blacks betrayed the very cause for which they were fighting.
The moment you resort to Negro soldiers, your white soldiers will be lost to you. The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the end of the revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong.
In my opinion, the worst calamity that could befall us would be to gain our independence by the valor of our slaves instead of our own. The day that the Army of Virginia allows a Negro regiment to enter their lines as soldiers, they will be degraded, ruined, and disgraced.
Of course, you'd think that in all of the Confederate records we have of the slave enlistment debate, including thousands of newspaper articles, somebody would have confirmed what Frederick Douglass and others had claimed, namely that there were already blacks serving as soldiers in the Confederate Army. But nobody did. To the contrary, they vehemently denied it. A Richmond war clerk named John Jones, who worked closely with the Davis administration throughout the war, had this to say about Northern rumors that there were black soldiers in the Confederate Army.
This is utterly untrue. We have no armed slaves to fight for us.
I'll say, though, let me go back. That quote. Nope, I didn't go back at all, did I?
About Northern rumors that there were black soldiers in the Confederate Army.
This is utterly untrue. We have no armed slaves to fight for us.
1863. So, things could have changed in 64. They could have changed in 65. I'm not saying they did. But that's when this comment was made. So, yeah, there probably weren't any slaves turned soldiers at that time. If there ever were.
For us.
Shit. Oh, I almost forgot. I actually got you something else. Oh? It's a big one.
Oh Lord, do my eyes deceive? A War of Northern Aggression themed chess set. Why, there's old Moss Robert himself and President Davis.
Yeah, Davis is the king and Lee is the queen. But, you know, Davis should really be the queen because of that whole rumor about how he was captured wearing one of his wife's dresses.
Unfounded slander. Oh, and look, here's the tyrant Lincoln. He must be the king, and Grant the Butcher is the queen. Now that is fitting, considering how Grant played the role of Desdemona in their production of Othello at that fort out west before the Mexican War.
Yeah, okay.
And for the role, he dressed as a woman.
Yeah, I get the joke. Yeah.
And the rook's got little cannons on him and everything. Thank you, Billy Yank. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too, my friend. Fancy a game?
Let's do it. I'll whip you harder than at first Manassas.
Why don't you move first? After all, you did start the war.
Ha ha, very funny.
All right. He did start the war. That was good. I like that. Well, I'm going to end this here. What does that VA do? I wish I could read what that said. Hail of a... I can't read it. Anyways. Oh, wrong button. I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe, or a steamroller will run over your genitals. I don't know what a steam wheeler is. Oh. Steamroller wasn't what I was wanting to say. Was it? I don't know. I don't know. I'm tired. I'm a tired boy. Alright. Have a good night. Have a good day. How about that?